In April this year, I went along to the annual general meeting of the local association of historians in the county of Västergötland in western Sweden. It's also called Geatland in English, and I'll use the names interchangeably. They have interesting stories to tell. Some of it's become accepted wisdom among their professional peers elsewhere in Sweden, though less well known to the public. Some of it's in the category of bold hypothesis, yet to be tested, but interesting. In 1926, a young W.H. Auden attended a lecture by Tolkien on Anglo-Saxon and Beowulf and decided, there and then, that he would make it a worthwhile academic pursuit. He later became friends with Tolkien and was an ardent champion of his work. Having convinced himself that his ancestors must have come from Iceland, he went to Iceland to seek inspiration in Nordic mythologies for his poetry.
W.H. Auden, the poet, was very much the modern poet of the day. He became the professor of poetry before I went down from Oxford. His second name was Wystan, which is a Nordic name, and Wystan Hugh Auden, his name. He believed that he was from Iceland, I think, and wrote a book called Letters from Iceland, where he went, sent by Faber and Faber to write a travel book of poems and a journal with Louis MacNeice, another well-known poet of the day. And he was fascinated by northern landscapes.
On the great plains of forever, where the cold fish is hunted, and everywhere the light birds flicker and flaunt, under the scolding flag the lover of islands may see at last, faintly, his limited hope. As he nears the glitter of glaciers, the sterile immature mountains intense in the abnormal day of this world, and a river's fan-like polyp of sand.
But privately Auden confessed that he felt a bit let down by Iceland. Here he is writing to a friend. In the middle of Reykjavik there's a shallow artificial lake full of terns and wild duck. The town peters out into flat rusty brown lava fields. Scattered shacks surrounded by wire fencing, stockfish drying and washing lines, and a few white hens. He often described the food he ate on his trip, but rarely with any enthusiasm. He survived on a diet of coffee and cigarettes. But the Edda, the Icelandic poetry and saga collection Auden admired the most, did not describe Iceland. Maybe Auden had been wasting his time. If only he had been better informed. Icelanders were a nation of immigrants, and their forefathers came from Sweden and Norway. The Edda was written by skalds or storytellers. Their tales featured the lands from which their ancestors came. The population of today's Västergötland is around 1 million. The rural eastern part, centred on the town of Skara, is what's historically interesting. It tends to be overlooked in modern Sweden, a country at the forefront of progressive attitudes and fashions. Yet it's not only Scandinavia's land of original myth, it's also the area where Swedes first coalesced into a state. Few Swedes know this. Västergötland represents Sweden's secret history.
Sweden is one of the most centralised countries in the world, and the reason why is that Stockholm has had a monopoly on history writing as a means to legitimise itself and run Sweden as it sees fit. History is propaganda, and history means control as well. So what we're going to do in this documentary is, by talking to the historians of the most prominent region outside Stockholm, Västergötland, we're going to get a new picture of Sweden, one that puts the birth of Sweden in a different place than Stockholm. Hopefully this will lead to greater regional pride and maybe even federal autonomy for Sweden, which sorely needs it. It's a country where an enormously prosperous and centralistic Stockholm coexists with the countryside, which barely gets its voice heard in Stockholm, and which is suffering from enormous rural problems due to people moving into the cities and lack of investment and interest by the politicians. Sweden probably needs the same reforms that Britain had 20 years ago when Scotland became independent, or independent with home rule. Scotland is now one of the most prosperous regions in the UK. Västergötland, Skåne and other regions could be the same. So this is the secret history of Sweden. When I was at school, we learned that everything came from Stockholm. The map of Sweden of 2,000 years ago had one or two towns in it, and they were both in the Mälardalen area. The rest of Sweden was a blank. We then learnt that the tribe of Svea, who were based in Stockholm, were the most civilized and advanced, and expanded outwards to invade and conquer other weaker tribes and impose their civilization on them. When I was younger, I always felt that the people of Stockholm had this in their knapsacks when they met you. They had a superiority complex, probably many reasons, but surely the feeling that they possessed history and that they were the civilizing force for the rest of Sweden was one of them. But starting in the 1980s, there was a counter-movement in Västergötland.
Man har nog gått i samma hjulspår alla tider, och man förvånar sig över att förändringarna är så oerhört långsamma. Nu ska jag tala om någonting som står i Sten Karlssons och Roséns historia, och det är den gamla myten om att svearna från Uppland har erövrat Västergötland någon gång. Nej, det kan man inte säga precis, därför att det finns överhuvudtaget inte någon enda källa som nämner detta, mer än möjligtvis dikten Beowulfkvädet. Och detta står, jag kan lätt säga sidan hos Sten Karlssons och Roséns historia, att när svearna hade, och vilka de är, det får man ju aldrig ordentligt reda på. Detta märkliga kollektiv. När de fann att det var meningslöst att avancera österut, därför att förhållandena i Bagdad-kalifatet och i Ryssland hade blivit för jobbiga, då vände man sig västerut och definitivt besegra götarnas rikestad. Och det skulle då ha hänt vid 1000-talet. Hur kan en sjömakt plötsligt bli en landmakt och börja göra landerövringar väst?
Ja, där stora vändningen kommer i början på 80-talet, närmast bestämt 1982, då en journalist vid Sveriges Radio och TV gjorde en lång programserie som heter Sveavärdets vagga. Där han vänder upp och ner på hela historieskrivningen och placerar vaggan i Götalandskapen, framförallt Västergötland men även Östergötland.
The programme talked to a lot of local historians, but the pièce de résistance was an interview with a leading Viking scholar of the English-speaking world, Professor Pete Sawyer of the University of Leeds. He was shown around all the major sites of Västergötland, such as the unexcavated King's Mound at Skarlunda, and said he was amazed at these fantastic treasures. The implication was that the first port of call for foreign scholars, the Swedish establishment, universities in the Stockholm area, had been remiss in failing to inform about Västergötland.
You're one of the world's leading experts on the Viking Age. You're very familiar with Vendel, Mälarlandskapen, Uppsala, Birka. You've been touring one day in Västergötland. What interested you most?
Well, as you say, it was only one day, and I'm ashamed not to know the area better. But I think two things fascinated me most about it. First of all, the ship settings. which we saw in various parts of the countryside, which reminded me that, of course, the water levels in the Viking period and before the Viking period were very different from their present levels. And we really ought to know a great deal more about that so that we can understand the history of the period properly and the settlements and the routeways and so on. And as a historian, the thing that fascinated me most, I think, was the extraordinary number of cases where we find a church built very close to one of these mounds. I mean, here it's not 100 metres away. And in some cases we have where the church appears to be a little distance away, the original church was much closer. This suggests that here, as elsewhere in Europe, when the church was established and churches were founded, they were founded in important places. And the pattern of churches in Västergötland, which is very richly endowed with churches, in fact, to a very large extent, reflects a power structure that was already well established long before Christianity reached this area.
So, might have been an old Viking here.
Well, it could perfectly well be somebody from the Viking period, and doubtless he could have been from time to time a Viking.
Viking? Från Västergötland? Kan det vara riktigt? Vi har ju fått lära att svenska vikingar drog från andra delar av landet österut. Och att det var danskar och norrmän som drog åt väster. De stora vikingautställningarna har visat västra Sverige som en vit fläck på kartan över vikingafärder. Och så påstår den engelske professor att Skalundahögen är en båtgrav. Och om den är av senare datum troligtvis gömmer en viking.
Varför Västergötland är ganska dåligt representerat när det gäller till exempel nu de stora vikingatidsutsställningarna som vi ju har i Stockholm och haft ute över världen här, kan ju bero delvis på att materialet är inte särskilt stort från vikingatiden. Det har antagligen en förklaring i att gravfynden är förstörda i väldigt stor utsträckning, och det kan vi kanske återkomma till.
De är alltså uppodlade?
De är uppodlade. Detta är ett gammalt odlingslandskap och gravarnas form är oansenlig och sådant. Det finns undantag, Dimbo och så, men det finns också många väldigt låga små högar som sannolikt helt bortplöjda och försvunna. Men det finns ju helt klara bevis på det, att vikingatåg har utgått härifrån. Vi har ju runstenar som berättar om detta, bland annat flera stycken. Men om vi drar oss lite tillbaka i tiden, om vi nu, du talade om guldrikedomen, så är det ju riktigt att det största mängden guld i något landskap i Sverige är funnet här i Västergötland.
Trots att man har grävt väldigt lite.
Just det. Men nu ska vi komma ihåg att guld är ju lätt att hitta och alltid intressant att omvandla på något sätt. Lite järnspikar och sånt, det kommer lätt bort. Men hittar man en liten guldten, även om den inte är så stor, så nog 17 tar man vara på den, och så småningom på omvägar och via antikhandlare och sånt hamnar den ofta på museer. Men oavsett det så kan jag säga att över 16 kilo guld från, ska vi säga, 400-500-talen efter Kristus finns från Västergötland. Om man då jämför med Öland, där jag har arbetat mycket, så har vi där ungefär 9 kilo guld. Och på Gotland är det något mindre, kanske en 6-7. Nu är detta inte någon 10 i topplista eller sådär, utan men det visar ju någonting, det är ju helt klart. Och till skillnad då från öarna så är det västgötska guldet i form av smycken, eller ganska vanligt i form av barrer på det här viset, alltså halvfabrikat eller tacker, och det gäller även om silvret här. Om vi ska gå över till vad det betyder mera konkret, så det är klart, detta måste vara en slags bytesbalans, det är helt klart. Och att vi hittat så lite, eller kan vi hittat så mycket trots att man gjort så få vetenskapliga insatser, tyder naturligtvis på att det finns mycket mer, det är ju helt klart. Vi har ju, det ska vi komma ihåg, icke en enda ordentligt undersökt boplats från hela järnåldern i Västergötland. Inte en enda.
Ja, för det första har ju alla de myndigheter som har haft med antikvariska forskningar att göra varit baserade i Stockholm. Och sen när det gäller mera spontana vetenskapliga arkeologiska grävningar, om det är det du tänker på, så kan jag ju bara säga som min förre kollega Karl-Axel Moberg att man ser alltid var det har funnits en professur i arkeologi, och vid ett universitet där har det skett ganska mycket. Där känner man ganska väl till det arkeologiska landskapet omkring. Här kom det ganska sent.
Så om det hade legat ett universitet exempelvis i Skara så hade vår historia sett lite annorlunda ut?
Det är jag rätt övertygad om.
Vilka bevis kan man säga för det att det var Västergötland som var viktigare än Mälardalen?
Ja, den mest handfasta bevisen är att Erikska kungaätten ligger begravd i Varnhem, som ligger ett par mil härifrån där vi befinner oss just nu i Skara. Och de Erikarna, de slogs med en annan kungaätt som kallas för Sverkarna, och de var bosatta i Östergötland, närmare bestämt Vreta. Till slut så enade de sig, och i mitten på 1200-talet och fick en gemensam kung, och denne kung besegrade då mälardalingarna vid ett slag i Sparrsätra 1247. Och det är omnämnt i något som kallas för Skänningeannalerna. Att då förlorade Upplands allmoge sin frihet och belades med skatter. Men detta faktum, denna urkund, den har bara mälardalingarna sopat undan och vill inte tala om.
They had a lot of evidence. The oldest kings were buried there, all by one. There were far more medieval churches in Västergötland than in Stockholm. Götaland didn't only accompany the Vikings of Denmark on their raids on England. They were part of the occupying force, as you can be seen on the rune stones of Västergötland. The people of the Mälardalen, far from being the original conquering, civilizing, expansive force of Scandinavia, as most Stockholmers seem to think today, was a region that was constantly under attack from the Finns, maybe Russian influences, and of course the Västergöta themselves. They were seldom united. The many fornborgar, which is a name for natural fortresses to which animals, children and women fled at times of trouble, are more numerous in Mälardalen than elsewhere in Sweden. There were many runestones indicating Christian allegiance, and in a vulgar common man's understanding of history, runestones equal civilization, but it actually showed that the Mälardalen area was intensely contested by the forces of heathendom and Christianity at a time when Västergötland was long since Christianized, and they spent their considerable wealth and energies building Sweden's largest number of churches. Birger Jarl, who founded Stockholm, was from Götaland and actually died and buried in Varnhem, which is in Västergötland. All the other early kings came from this region as well. What happened was, in the 16th century, after Stockholm had been founded by Västergöta in order to take advantage of the iron ore flow from the northwest of Sweden out through Lake Mälaren and down into the Baltic. German traders needed to be taxed, and the Västergöta founded Stockholm as a means to be able to both control the rebellious Upplänningar and be able to tax the German traders. But by the 16th century, Sweden was a genuine central state, expanding from Stockholm. And it needed a long and glorious history. Kings were given high numbers, and then a mythical backstory was given for the Swedish kings, suggesting Sweden's history is much longer than it actually was. So you had Eric the 14th, but there were no Erics 1 to 13. Names were made up and backgrounds were made up. Some court scribes even made Atlantis and Troy and the ancient Greeks to have been based in Sweden.
I mitten på 1600-talet när Sverige hade blivit en stormakt i Europa efter 30-åriga kriget. Men det var en professor då som heter Olof Rudbeck som var rektor för nybildade Uppsala universitet, som fick uppdrag av kunglig makt att skriva en ärorik historia för detta nyblivna europeiska stormakt. Och han lyckades över hövan. Han placerade Edens lustgård ett par mil härifrån. Och han placerade Platons sjunkna Atlantis runt Uppsala, uppe i Uppland. Och i den som idag är gamla Uppsala sockenkyrka hittade han spår efter Platons centrala tempel och ett hednatempel som finns omskriven hos prästläraren Adam av Bremen på 1000-talet.
The Swedes needed to believe they were exceptional people when Swedish men were in the army for 20 years at a time and conquering much of the rest of Northern Europe.
Sweden was a great power between 1618 and 1720, power based on genuine military prowess. Sweden was then a warlike country, feared for its innovative cavalry tactics and superb training. Though still small in population, Sweden rapidly conquered the Baltics and northern Germany. Eventually, Sweden's more populous neighbours ganged up on Sweden and defeated it. Peter the Great was the principal opponent. But for the century that Sweden's North European empire lasted, Sweden suffered from a strong cultural and historical inferiority complex for all its military successes. It was a small country, peripherally located, a latecomer to European affairs, and needed to compensate, so a fake history was written by historians employed by the king. Classic Greek links were appropriated in absurd ways, and of course done in such a way as to build up the importance of the new imperial capital of Stockholm. Västergötland, by now a backwater as a result of the Västgöta elite's colonization of Mälardalen, saw its genuinely interesting Norse history sidelined. That neglect of Sweden's real history has lasted till today.
But during its neutral period, it still retained much of its old great power history, because it didn't have any historians who went into the ancient history and just generation after generation published the old lies in the school books. Some of the most ridiculous ones, like Sweden and Atlantis, were taken off the books. But the fact that Stockholm was the centre of everything, and always had been, stayed in the history books. And even during the Social Democrats' long hegemony from 1932, this ancient interpretation of history stayed in, even though the Social Democrats were supposed to be about science, modernity, equality, the working class, the forgotten groups, rather than kings and oppressors and tyrants. Presumably because it suited the very Stockholm-centric Social Democrats. Continued to centre on Stockholm, which of course was the capital of a very redistributionist welfare state. The Social Democrats couldn't afford regional autonomy and regional power because it would upset their project of homogenizing the whole of Sweden and creating equality, basically, because autonomy meant that the different parts of Sweden could go their own ways, and as soon as you can go your own way, you can create inequalities. So the Sweden of kings and aristocrats was replaced by the Sweden of bureaucrats and socialists, but they had the same thing in common. Also, I think that the Swedish working class didn't much like the Swedish peasant class or independent farmer class. They had no sympathy with them, and they didn't share their experience.
The TV series The Cradle of Sweden was never shown again for political reasons. Maybe it ruffled too many feathers. Dag Stolfrö, the journalist who put it all together, became something of a pariah. He died a few years later in a car accident. 35 years on, a new generation of Västgöta historians are following the footsteps of Verner Lindblom, who pulled down the trousers of the Mälardalen establishment. There are new findings, new theories, and the old, by now professionally established story needs to be better communicated. There is a chronic lack of funding for new digs and a continuing destruction of Västergötland's old heritage.
Beowulf is significant because he connects to the mythical landscape of Tolkien, who is the world's most famous fantasy writer. Lord of the Rings borrowed elements from Beowulf and elements from the Edda, which is the ancient Icelandic poems. Now, these ancient Icelandic poems were supposedly drawn on Icelandic models, but these in turn are drawn from Scandinavian, Swedish and Norwegian models. And the writer and the assembler of these poems, Snorri Sturlason, actually lived in Västergötland for a while. So Tolkien owes a huge debt and drew upon the myths of this county, Västergötland.
Look at this cliff wall at Hallberg in Västergötland. Doesn't it look like the face of a warrior? Helmet, slits for eyes. In fact, it looks as though there are several warriors' faces all over the wall. This is the place that historians think was the source of the Valhalla myth, where fallen warriors recuperated until Ragnarok. I'd heard about this myth for quite a long time and decided to drive to see there for myself. Hallberg, or Hall Mount, cognate with Valhall, rises out of the Västergötland plain. Although a less than imposing sight as you approach it, it's not exactly an alpine range. The historian I'm about to see has grand claims. There's no place in eastern Sweden that matches the descriptions in the sagas, but this place surprisingly does. On the other side of the plateau you have the Trollhättan Falls, or used to have, the great wonder of northern Europe before it was dammed up for power reasons 100 years ago, a Niagara Fall of mist and loud noise which would have enveloped the far side of the mountain in a special environment. I drove as far as I could into the national park. It was quite a haunting experience. I was alone. The birdsong went quiet as I penetrated further and further. A pall hung in the air, as if something covered the sun. In that slightly oppressive atmosphere, I walk along the wooden boards that mark out the path until I manage to get lost by stepping away from them. Believe it or not, I see what looks like petrified Viking warriors' faces. See? And a death's head skull. I was lost for about 10 minutes and was happy to get out of there. A few days after that, I went back to the area to meet a local historian and consultant who's advised local museums on the origins of the Odin and the Valhalla myth. He's writing a book and it's his life's work. Hans Svensson showed me the Edda and the descriptions there that matched up to the features of Hallberg. He told me about the story of the founding of the Valhalla walls. There's still a moraine field next to a place called Thor's Lake, the stones that were not used for the wall. After we finish looking at maps, we hop into the car to head off on our expedition.
Utan det är väl under högst ett par veckors tid som man har möjlighet att se det. Ungefär en timme på tidigt på eftermiddagen någon gång.
Peka ut ögonen.
Ja, på örnen
ja.
Så är det då dels det här stora runda och det här som är lite mindre. Man ser ju örnen blickar ju lite åt sidan så. Så att huvudet på örnen har vi här. Med ena ögat ser man där, andra ögat här. Näbben går ner här med spetsen på näbben mitt emellan ögonen på Oden själv. Som man ser här, näsan är som det är täckt utav. Munnen halvöppen, hakan är tydligt markerad.
Fantastiskt, ja det stämmer.
Ja,
och vingarna?
Ja, vingarna på örnen, det är ju bergets övre kant som breder ut sig på ett mäktigt sätt.
Det verkar som om du verkligen har funnit någonting av djup mytologisk betydelse. Känner du att du har gjort det?
Ja, helt klart. Och jag skickade ju de här bilderna till Riksantikvarieämbetet 1999. Jag fick svar ifrån professor Ola Kylberg i Uppsala. Han skrev så här: en naturformation av den art som det här är frågan om
måste tidigt ha iakttagits och givits mytiska förklaringar. Då skrev han mytiska som mystiska med s-et inom parentes. Och så skrev han vidare då att fotografierna av ättestupan är anslående. Och så skrev han också en systematisk områdes- och ortnamnsanalys samt en arkeologisk utgrävning eller sondering skulle kanske kunna ge ett bidrag till den fängslande teorin om kult offerplats tillägnad Oden alltså.
Hans Svensson was inspired by the Swedish historian Carl Otto Fast, who pioneered Västergötland studies in the 30s. He showed that the Icelandic skalds could trace their roots to Västergötland. Snorri Sturlason, author of the revised or younger Edda, actually returned to his ancestral lands to study and stay for a while. Fast showed that the elder Edda featured a combination of scenery, natural features and animals that existed nowhere else in northern Europe but Västergötland. There are no forests or green scenery in Iceland. There are no bears or wolves in Norway, no plateaus or waterfalls in eastern Sweden, and no elk in Germany. But the Edda and Västergötland has all these descriptions. He made no headway with the Stockholm historical establishment, though. Half a century on, Hans Svensson has picked up the baton.
Och Yggdrasil är egentligen ett väldigt anmärkningsvärt namn. Ygg är egentligen namnet på Oden, ett namn på Oden, och Drasil är en häst. Så Yggdrasil betyder Yggs häst. Och det kan man ju säga är ett väldigt konstigt namn på ett träd. Men vi vet här att just vid den här bergväggen utefter dalen, här är lokaler för murgröna. Och i början på 1700-talet så var det en man som passerade här som hette, jag vill minnas att det var Erik Benselius. Där fann han en murgröna som växte upp i 5 grenar ända upp till toppen utav berget och jättestort. Han sa att det var ett av de härligaste träd jag ute i världen sett. En sån murgröna, den finns inte längre kvar och man vet inte exakt vad det var. Men man vet att det finns lokaler för murgröna nedanför den här klippan där detta ansikte uppenbarar sig. Om vi nu tänker oss att en murgröna då har växt upp så att den omslingrar det här ansiktet som jag nu har fotograferat, så kan man ju säga då att ansiktet rider så att säga i trädet, och man kan säga då att trädet blir som en häst som där ansiktet rider. Och därför så kan man säga att det konstiga namnet faktiskt har en naturlig förklaring. När det fanns kristna gravar här nere, hade funnits länge, så kan man säga också det var ju hedniska gravar uppe runt Mälardalen ända upp till långt in på 1100-talet. Och nu var det ju så här att det var mycket pengar i omlopp. Det var ju ett väldigt rikt handelsutbyte där uppe. Mycket pengar i omlopp. Och det vill naturligtvis makthavare gärna få makten över. Tidigare så hade de hållit sig borta ifrån kungarna här nere i alla fall. Och behövde inte betala någon skatt. Men det var ju Birger Jarl som skattlade dem till slut. Och infogade deras land i det gamla riket så att säga då, va? Och placerade en domkyrka. Då hade han naturligtvis påvens och hela katolska kyrkans stöd i ryggen, och kunde han då, alltså det är lite märkligt att man brukar säga i alla fall att Odenkulten förmodligen var minst 500 år tidigare här nere än där uppe i Mälardalen. Men samtidigt så dröjde den sig kvar längre där, för kristendomen kom också hit tidigare. Så att om det nu var hedniskt där uppe, så skulle man ju då, om man här nere kunde visa att man kunde få det området kristnat, och inte minst genom att placera en domkyrka där, så skulle det vara en jättestor seger, inte minst för kyrkan och påven, men även för de här nere som lyckades med detta. Och Birger Jarl lyckades med det. Han lyckades och
på något sätt när man kanske till och med överdrev hedenskapen för att ge en polarisering. Man sa att det var ännu mer.
Det kan man väl säga då, att det kunde ju vara en utav anledningarna. Man letade efter anledningar att ge sig på dem helt enkelt då, va? Bara för att ta makten över området.
His argument is that by an even more careful reading of the Edda, you can locate the origins of the Scandinavian version of the myth to this very precise place in Västergötland, Halaberg, For the people who lived below, it was a holy mountain, and the councils of the early kings were held here, beneath the face of Odin carved into the cliff walls. But something happened on the way to the modern era. It was easier for later generations in Stockholm to appropriate the Valhalla myth because of a sleight of hand involving Snorri Sturlason. His rewritten version of the Edda, the so-called Younger Edda, actually has the gods living in Mälardalen, even though the older Edda has them likely settled here in Västergötland. Was it part of a plot to make the Mälardalen people even more heathen than they actually were, in order to justify the occupation of them by the powerful, warlike and Christian Västergötland in the eyes of the powerful church down in Rome? In that case, the propaganda came to work against the Västergötland. When eastern Sweden eventually became the genuine centre, they could turn around and say, look, the birthplace of the Odin myth was here in the Stockholm area, just read Snorri. When Västergötland became a forgotten region, the locals then only had themselves to blame. They had given up their own history for a political lie which benefited them when they were strong, but backfired now when they were weak.
När det gäller Odens damm då, så är det så här att den fanns ju här nedanför den så kallade ättestupan, där jag då nu har fotograferat ett enögt ansikte krönt av en örn. Det vill säga Arnhövde, det vill säga Oden själv krönt av en örn. Nedanför fanns alltså en vattensamling som kallades Odens damm. Det fanns kvar ända in på 1920-talet, men då byggde man hus och fyllde igen. Det sades också att det var någon liten flicka som lär ha drunknat i den, och det var kanske det som avgjorde att man fyllde igen den, det sista. Vi vet att vi befinner oss nu i resterna utav ett gammalt gravfält från järnåldern, daterat till ungefär Kristi födelse. Den här domarringen är i stort sett, och den högen som är intill är vad som finns kvar. Men det har stått i centrum utav ett mycket större gravfält med bautastenar och andra flatmarksgravar som man har då hittat i samband med att man har grävt för väg och järnväg här, som man har gjort på 1800-talet. Nu säger jag så här, eftersom jag har hittat orden själv i klippan, att jag tror inte att det är vem som helst som ligger begravd i detta gravfältet närmast Oden själv. Jag tror att det är härskarna, kungarna, som man kanske inte från början kallade kungar utan någonting annat. Det är ju nämligen så, om man tittar i de gamla sagorna om de tidigaste kungarna i Norden, ynglingaätten, så sägs det ju det då att det var väldigt viktigt. De skulle ju vara fyllda av visdom. Om man säger till exempel om en kung som hette Dag, han kallades Dag den vise, för han var så vis att han kunde tyda fåglarnas sång, heter det. Då säger jag det, att om det är härskarna, det visaste utav de man kände på den tiden, som har blivit begravda här, så kan man säga att det mycken visdom är begravd i den jorden. Om det då finns en vattensamling som är kopplad till, är direkt kopplad till den jorden, så kan man ju säga att genom att dricka av det vattnet så får man del utav den visdom som är begravd i jorden. Därför så har till och med Oden själv offrat sitt ena öga för att få dricka av vattnet. Därför så vågar jag säga idag att eftersom jag tror att det är härskarna som ligger begravda här från början, så betraktar jag dalen som konungarnas dal i Norden. Vi har ju en konungarnas dal i Egypten. Jag tror att vi har en i Norden här också, alldeles nedanför den fascinerande klippan.
Before Christianity, before the cult of Odin, there were the sun gods. Anyone who's lived in today's Sweden knows how the environment changes profoundly with the virtual disappearance of the sun during the winter months. It's a miracle. Every spring after the barren season of brown earth and white snow, the countryside springs to life. The sun had to be nurtured and propitiated, though, in order to return, and for that you had a high priest. They were also the early kings of the Bronze Age. Eventually the cult of the sun god and the cult of fertility, same thing, was replaced by the cult of the warrior. And this process, as with Christianity, started in Geatland or Västergötland. Why is this so controversial?
Odenskulten kom först hit och fortsatte upp mot norr. De var senare där. Och sen kommer kristendomen först i Danmark och Norge. Och därför utsätts vi för stark påverkan. Och det är klart att det blir Västergötland som det kommer till då.
Hade Odenskulten vissa fördelar, psykologiska fördelar för de som trodde på det? Blev de bättre krigare då? Det är därför de tog över efter soldyrkan?
Ja, just det. För man kan säga att den som ledde dem, deras hövding, han var ju då son till en gud. Och han förkroppsligade den här guden när han anförde dem i strid. Så visst, det var istället för att han som tidigare var solens son och förkroppsligade solen, så förkroppsligade han nu guden istället. Ska jag säga att jag tror Odenskulten omkring 100-talet kan man säga, så börjar man prata om Wodan nere i Tyskland. Och sen så sprider sig den kulten, så under 200-talet så går den upp genom Danmark. Kommer in över till oss, kanske på 300-talet.
Some of the fertility cult and the idea of a moon and a sun god lived on in the Odin cult when it took over. You had Odin's ring Draupnir, which was associated with the sun, which he used to command the world with, and which Tolkien took inspiration from when he wrote the book Lord of the Rings, and the all-powerful ring that ruled them all. The fertility god concept transformed into the fertility god Frey in the Norse myth. Both Odin and Frey were supposed to be buried at Uppsala near Stockholm, though we now know that they're associated with Hallberg and Västergötland. The official story of Sweden, appearing in schoolbooks as recently as a few years ago, is that the country was Christianized from Mälardalen and outwards, starting from the old trading town of Birka near Stockholm by St. Ansgar. But it's wrong. Ansgar was just a ship's priest who tended to the Christian needs of the foreign traders who lived in Birka. He left no church, no graveyard, and no local Christian converts. So how did Christianity come to Sweden? In the 500s, Irish missionaries probably came to the west coast and settled in the kingdom of Higelac, the mythical Beowulf's people. But the pagans defeated them. But they came back to the west of Sweden, spread the word, and encouraged the locals to abandon Odin a few hundred years later. Eventually, in 1015, Sweden's first diocese was founded in Skara, 150 years before a diocese was founded in Uppsala in eastern Sweden. Uppsala was the traditional centre of Swedish ecclesiastical history, and later became the seat of the archbishop. But Skara and Götaland were first. State formation followed the establishment of the church, as a mutually beneficial contract between local kings and the church followed. The kings could benefit from the church's administrative and clerical skills and knowledge of law to expand their domains, while receiving legitimacy from the church's promise of eternal life. The church, meanwhile, received royal military protection. In tandem, the process expanded outwards and upwards from Västergötland up towards Stockholm. The county museum in Skara has been telling this story for ages, and 15 kilometres from Skara Cathedral is another impressive church, Varnhem, where nearly all the early kings of Sweden are buried. Knowledge of Varnhem elsewhere in Sweden is limited. It doesn't feature in most school history books, yet Varnhem was the central power nexus of early medieval Sweden. On a hill overlooking this church, archaeologists have excavated the crypt of another church, which has been dated to the 9th century, making it Sweden's oldest church building. It's been linked to English architectural styles, and thousands of coins linked to Ethelred the Unready were found here, establishing a link between England and Västergötland. There's evidence of Christian burial rites, unburnt, uncremated bodies from the late 9th century. That's nearly 300 years before the archbishopric was established in Uppsala in eastern Sweden. Evidence yet again of the power and importance of early Västergötland. However, the excavations were not founded by the Swedish state, but by local companies. I tried to get an interview with the chief archaeologist of the museum in Skara, Maria Vretemark, an extremely competent woman whom everybody said I should talk to. She holds seminars around the country about the excavation work she and her colleagues are engaged in, and a very good job they do. One evening I go along to a seminar at the local museum. I talked to her briefly afterwards, then emailed, but no interview ever materialised. But she did tell me during our informal chat that there were many sites of huge importance that remained unexcavated in the area. One such site I visited a few days later. This is Hångers Point near Skara, teeming with bird life in spring from the nearby lake Kornborga. Flocks of large birds swirl, swoop, and land on the luminously green cow's fields. I head for a copse of trees under which there are an unusual concentration of stones, some with a man-made appearance. Is this the deserted Viking graveyard in which King Inge was buried, as some historians say? King Inge was the first Christian king of Västergötland, representing the first attempt by the Västergötar to Christianize the heathen Svea and Mälardalen. He failed, was driven off, and burned down the heathen temple in Uppsala on his way out. He licked his wounds back in Västergötland and apparently died here. The Mälardalen continued their heathen practices until 150 years later, Birger finally succeeded in overwhelming them. King Inge was buried on a site near the Lake Kornborga then. That's what I'm told. There were houses here too, perhaps even a small village. It's all gone now. The historical information on the site is underwhelming. To the untutored eye, it looks just like a copse littered with stones, though some clearly crafted by men. There's a photograph on the internet of Inge's tomb, a symmetrical grave slab, but try as I might, I cannot find it. There are no information boards anywhere. I had to head back to the car before the sun set. This is clearly an area that calls for research, excavation, money and visitors information. This kind of oversight, where Sweden's most important early figure lies unmarked in a cow's field, would never have been allowed in Mälardalen. In this program from the 1980s, officials admitted that 85% of state funding for archaeology goes to the Stockholm area.
De stora anslagen har till 70-80% gått till forskningsinstitutionerna i Stockholm i första hand och till mindre utsträckning också omkring där. Medan Västsverige har fått 2-3%.
Many of the best historians in Sweden accept the new interpretation of Swedish history, but there's still resistance in wider society and a shortage of funding that could cement Västergötland's centrality even further. Vretemark and her colleagues have to balance precariously between their official position as state employees, which demands a certain caution in relation to Stockholm, and their own ambition to tell the truth and break new ground. Historians outside the system are less cautious about presenting bold hypotheses. One, for instance, who argues that Mälardalen was a matriarchy, which could explain the relative persistence of the fertility and sun god cult over the Odin cult, and the low levels of aggression that explain maybe why they were eventually invaded by Västergötland rather than vice versa. I was still curious to meet an insider, someone from the official museum world, and I was lucky to get into contact with Martin Turesson, the clever young director of a small local museum near Skara, who was willing to stick his neck out. He had his top candidates for potential excavations which would change our view of Västergötland even more, and he'd found an unorthodox funding route, since the central government still has a preference for Mälardalen. Not as unorthodox as the food factory that funds some local digs, but get this, EU farming funding. We met at his current digs, the mysterious ancient ship setting at Askeberga. He's done georadar work, but has no permission yet, even for carbon dating, which isn't even that invasive. He's still young, and is not going to give up in the first instance.
We just have to look at the Viking era and earlier around here, not with the same way as you do in other up in Mälardalen, but just look at for what it is here and go from that. And it's not always people have done that, and that's a problem, I think, anyway. So if you go from that, take what's on the ground in each different area, and you will probably come to some really interesting conclusions. Now and again, I just get the feeling that some of these really old interpretations have been put into our history books. And now we have the possibility and the time to really say, well, we could look over this again and try to figure out what it really is like. And I don't get the idea when I look at things that we have Svealand and they conquer everything else. I got a little bit of a pushback really when I was working up in Stockholm a couple of years ago from some of them. And I realized how infected this was even for them as well. So I got a little bit surprised that it was so infected for them. But this map is also almost like a mental map of the medieval era. And we are then looking between the lakes Vänern and Vättern, and this area in between the lakes, that's where we're situated today. And in the northeast of that area, that's where we are now. This is gold found down here. That's called Barnkälla gold. And that's then, much of this gold is probably from the Roman Empire, probably from mines in Romania and Spain to begin with. But somehow in the 500s it just flows into Sweden, and the majority, 35%, ends up in Skaraborg and in Västergötland.
This is interesting. This piece of jewellery goes to Stockholm. Does it sit in the National Museum?
Yeah, it's up there. Most of the gold is up there at the moment.
I mean, isn't that a bit unfair that it sits up there and not in the place where it belongs?
It could be annoying, and I find it a bit irritating at times. And it wouldn't be so bad if they just would. It would be easy accessible, but it's a bit tricky to get hold of it.
And then do they inform the viewer where it was based or where it was found?
Usually they do, but now and again. But it's just not very obvious.
And they don't place it into context or tell the bigger story?
The bigger stories around Västergötland is usually never told because we haven't figured it out properly yet. And there haven't been much interest in figuring it out either. So, and it's just this human thing. You are closer to home than you are to somewhere else, I think. So, to do?
And it's hard to get Stockholm historians to engage in this gestalt shift, which looks at Sweden in a different way, maybe.
It's tricky. It's I get a feeling that it's on the move slowly, but it's getting there. But it also, there is an older, more conservative tradition that's not as keen. And partly, I think, just people are having quite a big material up there and doing what they can with that material. But I would really like to see more work done down here. And it's not easy to bury a career with 30 years down here and get amazing results if you really wanted to. But the thing is, it's not easily accessible. You really have to go to different sources. Sometimes we have to go to different museums, not only archeological literature, but maybe local history literature and 1800 stories, things like that. So you have to make...
It's harder work, but it's more rewarding. And if you went into the usual already established wheel tracks or wheel ruts, it's easier to make a career because you follow the established history writing rather than break new ground and create new paradigm based on all this research from different sources.
Yes, no, it's easier to when you refer to sources people recognize. It's that author, it's that professor. We know him. We know what he usually talks about and how he arguments for things. Then it's easier to follow in a way. But when you turn up with a quite obscure newspaper from 1930s and somebody said, well, I found something interesting, and then it ended up in a local museum, and you really have to dig into the museum catalogue to figure out where did it go. It's quite a painstaking work in a way, but at times you find really golden nuggets, sometimes even not just literally, but really.
You have to be young and dedicated, and is that something you're willing to do, to carry on and down this wheel track?
Well, I'm slowly becoming not so young anymore, I'm afraid, so I've come to an end in a way where I feel that I can't do the things I would do when I'm 20, but I can't really drop this one. I'm still going to work and try to figure out what's going on.
What we've learned from this documentary is that the centre of Swedish history is not Stockholm, as most Swedes and nearly all foreigners think, but the province in the area of Västergötland, which has a continuous history of thousands of years. It was the first to get a sun god, the first to adopt Odin, the first to be Christianized. Geatish warriors went west to England, and civilization and the organised church came in the other direction, allowing the petty kings of the area to start the state formation process, eventually expanding to the Stockholm area. The reason is, why is this so sensitive, since the English have no problem admitting that Winchester was the first capital, not London, or the Danes have no problems admitting that Copenhagen was not central to the Danish state formation process? Only the academics of Stockholm could tell you that. For instance, there's a neurotic quest by Stockholm's archaeologists to find the bones of King Magnus Ladulås, the son of Birger Jarl. He was not buried in the central Stockholm church for royal burials, the Saint Denis of Sweden, as it were, as once thought. Bone tests show otherwise. Could he even have been buried in Västergötland like his father, thus providing another nail in the coffin of the official history? A Skara local historian, Britta Plank, thinks the whole thing is rather silly.
For instance, right now they are trying to find the bones of a Swedish king in a church in Stockholm. They know he's buried there because all the stories about it is that it's buried there. And depending on his being buried there, it's also making Stockholm kind of capital of Sweden. So now they're trying to find his bones, and they have been digging in different places and where, that's been said that he's been buried. But they haven't found them yet. And I don't think it's really interesting, because either if they find them or if they don't find them, Stockholm is still the capital of Sweden.
But silly or not, there are historians in Stockholm fighting a rearguard action. They have contacts in the media, ties to important institutions, and the weight of cultural inertia in their favour. The Museum of National History in Stockholm, arbiter of state cultural historical policy, clearly has more important fish to fry than displaying the old county's role as the cradle of Sweden, like demonstrations and HBTQ in 21st century Sweden. Västergötland is not mentioned at all in a visit I made recently. All the historians I interviewed faced challenges in areas of research. Dr. Nordegren had to complete his doctorate on the early martial history of Västergötland in Denmark. He wrote about the celebrated Gothic people who sacked Rome and marauded across southern Europe, and their links with the people of Västergötland. The similar names suggest connections after all. Hans Svensson is angry at the archeological vandalism taking place around his beloved Halleberg in the Valley of Kings. Turning the camera, you see the Swedish state railways have driven tracks straight through the area, just meters from the grave mounds. Peter Jarntoft doesn't think he can get domestic funding for his Beowulf project, while Ingmar Siby lodged an official complaint when Swedish state television did the history of the Vikings recently, which repeated the old lie about Birka's importance for the development of Swedish Christianity.
Vi har enorma skatter i Västergötland som bara ligger och väntar under jord på att grävas fram. Men vi är bakbundna för att det finns inga ekonomiska medel till det. Vi har stora vikingaskepp som ligger uppe i Vänern och väntar på att grävas ut, som är 20, 22, 24 meter långa, som Mosebergsskeppen och Gokstadsskeppen. Men det finns inga marinarkeologiska medel till det. Arkeologer har vi, men det finns inga pengar. Västergötland är Sveriges mest kyrktätaste område. Åker du här i Västergötland så har du 2, 3, 4 kilometer mellan kyrkorna. Åker du i övriga landet så är det 4-5 mil mellan kyrkorna. Här är så kyrktätt så att man fick till och med riva kyrkor på 12, 13, 1400-talet. Svårarbetat dock för oss som är i den här branschen, det är våra skolor och skolbarn, våra barn och ungdomar. Och det tycker jag är synd, för att det är där egentligen vi måste börja för att skola in våra barn och ungdomar och lära sig av vår västgötska och svenska historia.